He always believed that love was just a detail in the life of a powerful man. But when the woman who captured his heart revealed a painful secret, his worldview changed forever. Time was short, but he was determined to prove that some loves are eternal. Jack Harrison adjusted his Italian silk tie in front of the mirror in his Manhattan penthouse. The reflection showed a 35-year-old man at the peak of success, meticulously trimmed hair, tailored suit, and a watch that cost more than many luxury cars. His expression, however, carried that characteristic boredom of someone who had already conquered everything money could buy. Another charity event, he thought, as he picked up the keys to his Ferrari. As president of the country's largest technology conglomerate, his presence was practically mandatory at these events. It was good for the company's image, his advisors said. For Jack, it was just another predictable night among predictable people. The ballroom of the Ritz-Carlton was decorated with a refinement that only millions could afford. Crystal chandeliers reflected light on designer dresses and expensive jewelry. Jack automatically greeted dozens of familiar faces, businessmen, socialites, politicians, all part of the same exclusive circle he had frequented for years. That's when he saw her. Amidst the sea of famous brand dresses and elaborate hairstyles, she stood out for her simplicity. She wore a basic navy blue dress without flashy jewelry, just a delicate pearl necklace that seemed to be a family heirloom. Her brown hair fell naturally over her shoulders, and there was something in her smile that seemed genuine. A rarity in that environment. She was serving coffee to a group of elderly people at one of the tables, not like a waitress, but with the care of someone who really cares. Jack found himself observing how she bent down to hear better what they were saying, how she laughed unreservedly at their stories, how she gently touched their shoulders in a gesture of affection. "Who is that young woman?" he asked Michael, his vice president and longtime friend. "Emily Carter," Michael replied, consulting the event program. "She's one of the coordinators of the social project we're sponsoring today. She works with elderly people in vulnerable situations." Jack felt something different, a curiosity he hadn't experienced in a long time. He approached the group where Emily was, grabbing a glass of champagne on the way. "You're right, Mrs. Johnson," Emily was saying to a white-haired lady. "The most beautiful love stories are those that catch us by surprise." "How can you know that, young lady?" teased the lady with a mischievous smile. "So young and already understand love?" Emily laughed, a crystalline sound that made Jack smile involuntarily. "Maybe I don't understand that much, Mrs. Johnson, but I learn every day from the stories you tell me." It was at that moment that their eyes met. Jack expected to see the typical recognition in her eyes. After all, his face was constantly in business magazines and social columns. But what he found was different. Emily looked at him as if he were just another person in the room, without the reverence or calculated interest he was used to. "Good evening," he approached, extending his hand. "Jack Harrison." "Emily Carter," she replied with a firm handshake. "I was just talking about your project with our friends here. The renovation of the community center will make a huge difference in their lives." Jack realized that she spoke about the project as if he weren't the owner of the company, as if he were just another collaborator. It was refreshing. "Actually," he confessed, "I'd like to know more about the work you do. I have the impression that we invest in many projects, but we don't always really know the impact they cause." Emily raised an eyebrow, as if assessing him. "Well, if you really want to know, why don't you visit us one of these days? No tie, no photographers, no ceremony, just to meet our seniors and hear their stories." The proposal caught him by surprise. No one in his social circle would be so direct, so devoid of affectation. "How about tomorrow?" He found himself saying to his own amazement. It was Emily's turn to be surprised. "Tomorrow? But surely you must have more important commitments." "Nothing more important than getting to know up close where we're investing," he replied, knowing he would have to rearrange his entire schedule, cancel meetings, postpone important decisions. But something about that woman intrigued him deeply. "All right then," Emily smiled, taking a napkin and writing down an address. "At 9 in the morning. And remember, no tie." The rest of the night passed like a blur for Jack. He mechanically fulfilled his social obligations, but his thoughts kept returning to Emily, to the way she treated people, how her smile reached her eyes, how she seemed completely oblivious to the power he represented. Back in his penthouse, Jack discarded his Italian suit over a designer armchair and poured himself a whiskey. He stopped in front of the window that offered a panoramic view of New York City, the city lights reflecting in the crystal glass. For years, that view made him feel on top of the world, as if the entire city was at his feet. But that night, for the first time in a long time, Jack Harrison found himself thinking that perhaps, just perhaps, there was more to life than what his fortune could buy. The napkin with the address written by Emily rested on his coffee table. A simple handwriting, without flourishes, like her. Jack smiled, imagining what it would be like to see her in her environment, away from the spotlights and artificial glamour of charity events. He picked up his phone to send a message to his assistant, asking her to reschedule all his appointments for the next day. He knew it would cause a small chaos in his company. After all, he never changed his schedule at the last minute. But something told him it was worth it. As he prepared for bed, Jack realized he was anxious like a teenager before the first date. It was a long-forgotten feeling, buried under years of negotiations, mergers, and acquisitions. Lying in his king-size bed, with Egyptian sheets that cost a small fortune, Jack found himself thinking about the words he had heard Emily say. The most beautiful love stories are those that catch us by surprise. He didn't know it yet, but that night marked the beginning of a story that would completely change his life. A story that would teach him that the true treasures of life cannot be bought, stored in safes or displayed at social events. A story that was just beginning. The next morning, Jack woke up before the alarm even went off. For the first time in years, he felt nervous about choosing an outfit. After much hesitation, he opted for jeans and a light blue shirt, the simplest pieces he found in his closet full of designer clothes. He looked at himself in the mirror and barely recognized himself without his usual Italian suit. The community center was located in a neighborhood in Queens, far from the mirrored skyscrapers of the financial district, where he usually spent his days. Jack drove his own car, leaving his driver surprised by the dismissal. He parked the Ferrari in front of a simple but well-maintained building, with a small sign identifying the New Dawn Community Center. Emily was waiting for him at the entrance, wearing a simple floral dress and an apron with the center's logo. Her smile was even more radiant in the daylight. "You really came," she said, clearly surprised, "and without a tie, as promised." "I always keep my promises," Jack replied, trying to ignore the warmth he felt upon seeing her smile. Emily guided him through the interior of the center, introducing him to the staff and volunteers. The place was modest, but overflowing with life and human warmth. On the walls, photos of events and activities showed genuine smiles of seniors participating in craft workshops, dance classes, and moments of socializing. "Has Mrs. Johnson arrived?" "Yet?" Emily asked one of the volunteers. "She's in the garden, as always," replied the young woman. "Said the roses needed special attention today." Emily led Jack to a small garden at the back of the center. There they found Mrs. Johnson, the same lady from the charity event, lovingly tending to a rose bed. "Look who decided to visit us," she exclaimed upon seeing Jack. "Emily, my dear, you managed to bring the important man to our humble home." Jack noticed the playful tone in the lady's voice. "Actually, Mrs. Johnson, I'm learning that maybe I'm not that important after all." The morning passed quickly. Jack found himself engaged in conversations with the seniors, listening to their life stories, their experiences, their joys and challenges. To his surprise, none of them seemed impressed by his status or fortune. They treated him as they would treat anyone else, with simplicity and affection. During lunch, served at a long table where everyone sat together, Jack observed Emily interacting with the seniors. She knew each one by name, knew their preferences, their stories. It wasn't just work for her, it was a mission. "You know, young man," Mrs. Johnson commented, sitting next to Jack, This girl is an angel who fell from heaven. When my husband passed away, I thought my life was over. But Emily, she showed me that there's always a new dawn." Jack noticed how the lady's eyes sparkled when talking about Emily. "She seems to have that effect on people," he commented, his gaze following Emily as she helped an elderly man with his meal. "Ah, but don't think it was always easy for her," Mrs. Johnson continued. "Life has tested this girl a lot. Even so, she never lost her ability to smile, to believe in good, to see beauty where others only see problems." Those words sparked even more curiosity in Jack. What was behind that luminous smile? What stories did Emily carry with her? After lunch, Emily invited him to see the center's library, a cozy space with shelves full of donated books and comfortable armchairs where the seniors usually gathered to read or chat. "This is my favorite place," she confessed, lovingly running her fingers along the spines of the books. "Each of these volumes tells a different story, just like each of the people who frequent the center. Stories of love, of overcoming, of new beginnings." "And what's your story, Emily?" Jack asked softly. She looked at him with a mixture of surprise and hesitation. For a moment, Jack saw something pass through her eyes, a shadow of sadness perhaps, but it was so quick that he might have imagined it. "My story?" She smiled, but there was something different in her smile now. "It's nothing extraordinary, really, just a small-town girl who came to the big city in search of her dreams." "Something tells me there's much more behind that," Jack gently insisted. Emily seemed to consider for a moment before responding. "Maybe there is, but not all. Stories need to be told at once, right? Some need time." Jack's phone rang, interrupting the moment. It was his assistant, reminding him of an unavoidable international video conference in an hour. The reality of his corporate world was calling him back. "I need to go," he said, with genuine regret in his voice. "But can I come back tomorrow?" Emily seemed surprised by the request. "Don't you have a company to run?" "I do, but I also have a lot to learn here," he answered sincerely. "Besides, I promised Mrs. Johnson I'd listen to the story of how she met her husband." Emily laughed, that crystalline sound that was already becoming familiar to Jack. "Well, in that case, tomorrow we have a painting workshop. I hope you don't mind getting your hands dirty." "It would be my pleasure," he replied, surprising himself with how much he really meant it. On the way back to the office, Jack found himself thinking about how a single day could change his perspective so much. The community center, which before was just another number on a social investment spreadsheet, now had faces, names, stories. And Emily. She was a mystery he very much wanted to unravel. Sitting in his office with a panoramic view, participating in the video conference about mergers and acquisitions, Jack was surprised to find himself doodling on his notepad. They weren't numbers or business strategies. It was a small drawing of a rose, like the ones Mrs. Johnson cultivated so carefully in the center's garden. His world of luxury and power was slowly beginning to gain new colors, new meanings, and he could hardly wait for the next day, when he could return to that simple place where, paradoxically, he was discovering the most valuable things that money couldn't buy. The following weeks passed like a dream for Jack. His mornings at the community center became sacred, and not even the most important meetings could make him give up those moments. His assistant, Jennifer, no longer hid her astonishment at seeing the country's most powerful CEO reorganizing his entire schedule because of a social project. On that particular morning, Jack arrived at the center carrying a box of imported painting materials. It was art workshop day, and he wanted to surprise the seniors with the best quality brushes and paints. "You didn't have to do this," Emily said when she saw him, but her eyes sparkled at the sight of the materials. "Our old brushes were still working." "Working doesn't mean ideal," he responded with a smile. "Besides, Mrs. Johnson told me she always wanted to try oil painting." Emily shook her head, laughing. "She has you wrapped around her finger, you." "So no, I've never seen Mrs. Johnson manipulate someone with such mastery." The activity room soon filled with laughter and lively conversations. The seniors were having fun with their paintings, some revealing surprising talents, others simply enjoying the moment of creation. Jack observed Emily moving among them, offering words of encouragement, helping with color mixing, always with that smile that illuminated the entire environment. It was then that he noticed something different. For a brief moment, Emily brought her hand to her chest, as if feeling some discomfort. Her expression changed subtly, a shadow passing over her face before she resumed her usual smile. But Jack noticed that something wasn't right. "Are you okay?" he asked discreetly when he managed to approach her. "Of course," she answered too quickly. "Just a little tired. I didn't sleep well last night." Jack wasn't convinced, but he respected her answer. In recent days, he had noticed other small signs, occasional paleness, moments of fatigue that she tried to disguise, doctor's appointments marked on her calendar that she avoided mentioning. "Look at this masterpiece, Mrs. Johnson's voice interrupted his thoughts. The lady proudly showed her painting, a garden of roses in vibrant tones. "Jack, my dear, you need to see how vivid the colors turned out with these new brushes." The rest of the morning went on normally, but Jack couldn't get the expression of discomfort he had seen on Emily's face out of his mind. When the workshop ended and the seniors began to say goodbye, he sought her out again. "How about lunch?" he invited. "I know a great restaurant nearby." Emily hesitated. "I don't know, Jack. I have some things to organize here." "Please," he gently insisted. "You need to eat properly, and I promise I won't take up too much of your time." To his surprise, she accepted. The restaurant was simple but cozy, very different from the sophisticated places Jack usually frequented. They sat at a discreet table, and he noticed how Emily seemed more relaxed there than in the luxurious environments where he had first met her. "You know," she began, playing with her napkin, "sometimes I wonder what a businessman like you is still doing in a simple place like our center." Jack looked her in the eyes. "I think the question is, how could I have lived so long without knowing a place like this?" Emily smiled, but there was a hint of melancholy in her gaze. "You've changed a lot since that first night at the charity event." "Thanks to you," he responded with sincerity. "You showed me a world I didn't even know existed, a world where people's value isn't measured by their bank balance or the brand of car they drive." "And that doesn't scare you?" she asked, her voice almost a whisper. "All this change?" On the contrary, Jack leaned slightly over the table. "For the first time in a long time, I feel like I'm really living, not just existing." Lunch arrived, and Jack noticed that Emily ate little, even though she had chosen a light dish, another detail that added to his growing concern. "Emily," he began carefully, "you know you can count on me, right? For anything." She looked at him for a long moment, as if fighting an internal battle. "Jack," her voice trembled slightly, "there are things about me that you don't know, things that could change everything." "Nothing could change what I feel for you," the words came out before he could contain them. Emily paled, and for a moment Jack feared he had said too much, too soon. But then she smiled, that smile that made his heart race, even though there was now something sad in it. "You're an amazing man, Jack Harrison," she said softly. "But sometimes life has different plans than ours." Before he could respond, her cell phone rang. It was from the center. One of the seniors needed help with a personal problem. Emily apologized, but Jack understood. It was who she was, always, putting others first. "Let me pay for lunch," he offered when she started looking for her wallet. "No, please," she insisted. "You already do so much for the center. Let me pay my share." Jack admired her independence, even though his instinct was to want to protect her, take care of her. There was something about Emily that awakened feelings in him that he had never experienced before. Not just love and desire, but a deep admiration for her strength, her dignity, her ability to do good without expecting anything in return. On that, the way back to the center, walking side by side on the neighborhood streets, Jack felt a growing urgency to declare himself, to say everything he was holding in his heart. But something in Emily's behavior made him hesitate. It was as if she were building an invisible barrier, gentle but firm, between them. Back at the center, before saying goodbye, Emily stopped at the door of her small office. "Jack, thank you for everything, for lunch, for the painting materials, for making us seniors so happy. How you don't need to thank me, he replied, resisting the urge to touch her. I'm the one who should be thanking you for finding you. For a brief moment, her eyes filled with tears, but she quickly contained them. Tomorrow we'll have bingo. She changed the subject, forcing a smile. Don't be late. Jack nodded, respecting her need to maintain distance. But as he drove back to the office, his mind wouldn't stop working. There was something Emily wasn't telling him, something important. And for the first time in his life, he felt that no amount of money or power could help him discover what it was. In his office at the company, looking at the city through the mirrored windows, Jack made a decision. Regardless of what Emily was hiding, he was willing to wait, to prove that his feelings were true and lasting. Because somehow, inexplicably, that simple woman had become the most important person in his life. Autumn was beginning to paint the trees of New York City with golden hues when Michael, Jack's vice president, decided to intervene. After another meeting where his friend seemed distant, lost in thought, he closed the door to Jack's office and sat down in front of him. "You're in love with her, aren't you?" he asked bluntly. Jack looked up from the papers he was pretending to read. "Is it that obvious? To someone who's known you for 20 years. "Yes," Michael smiled. "I've never seen you like this, not even with Olivia." The mention of his ex-fiancée made Jack reflect. His relationship with Olivia had been perfectly adequate on paper. They both came from traditional families, frequented the same circles, shared the same vision of success. But there was never that spark, that deep connection he felt with Emily. "It's different this time," Jack admitted. "Emily, she makes me want to be a better person, you know? Not for what others will think, but for myself." Michael leaned back in his chair, studying his friend. "And why haven't you declared yourself to her yet?" "It's not that simple," Jackie sighed. "There's something she's not telling me. Sometimes I feel like she wants to get closer, but then she pulls away, as if she's afraid." "Afraid of what, your money?" "No," Jack shook his head. "Emily doesn't care about that. It's something deeper. In the last few days, I've noticed that she's not well. Little signs." "What kind of signs?" Michael asked, now genuinely concerned. "Fatigue, sudden paleness, doctor's appointments that she tries to hide." Jack ran his hand through his hair, a gesture of frustration. "And when I try to ask, she changes the subject." At the community center that same afternoon, Emily was also facing her own questions. Sitting in her small office, she looked at the results of the latest tests she had picked up earlier at the hospital. "You need to tell him," Mrs. Johnson said softly, entering the office without knocking, a privilege only she had. Emily quickly folded the papers. "I can't, Mrs. Johnson, I can't do this to him." The lady sat down beside her, taking her hands in hers. "My dear, that man is completely in love with you. Anyone can see that." "That's exactly why," Emily replied, tears shining in her eyes. "Jack has a whole life ahead of him. I can't enter his life knowing that." "Knowing what?" A male voice interrupted from the door. Emily and Mrs. Johnson turned in surprise. Jack was standing at the entrance, holding a bouquet of roses, Emily's favorites he had discovered. His face showed a mixture of concern and determination. "Jack!" Emily quickly stood up, hiding the exams in a drawer. "I wasn't expecting you. This afternoon." "Clearly," he replied, his gaze alternating between her and Mrs. Johnson. "I came to surprise you, but it seems I'm the one being surprised." Mrs. Johnson stood up, gently squeezing Emily's arm. "I think you two need to talk," she said, heading to the door. As she passed Jack, she whispered, "Be patient with her." When they were alone, silence weighed between them. Emily seemed smaller, more fragile, as if all the weight she carried finally manifested in her posture. "They're beautiful," she finally said, looking at the roses. "Emily," Jack approached, placing the flowers on the table. "Please, talk to me. What's going on?" She looked away, her hands trembling slightly. "I can't." "Can't or won't?" he asked softly. "Because if it's a matter of not wanting to, I'll respect that. But if it's can't..." "Emily, you're not alone. Whatever it is, We can face it together." His words hit her like waves breaking against an already fragile wall. Emily felt her defenses beginning to crumble. "You don't understand," she whispered. "I don't want you to suffer. I don't want you to have to deal with this." Jack took another step towards her. "And what if I want to? What if I choose to be by your side, no matter what it is?" "You have a perfect life, Jack," she argued. Her voice choked. "An important company, huge projects, a bright future ahead." "A perfect life?" He laughed without humor. "Emily, before I met you, I had a perfect existence. Now I have a life. You showed me what's really important. How can I go back after that?" Tears began to run down her face. Jack resisted the urge to wipe them away, knowing he needed to give her space to process her emotions. "I'm afraid," she finally admitted. "Afraid of making you suffer. Afraid of not having enough time." "Enough time for what?" Jack asked, his heart racing with a presentiment he didn't want to admit. Emily opened her mouth to answer, but was interrupted by an urgent knock on the door. It was one of the center's caregivers. "Emily, sorry to interrupt, but Mr. Thompson is having an anxiety attack. Only you can calm him down." Emily's professional instinct immediately overrode her personal emotions. "I'm coming," she replied, quickly wiping away her tears. Before leaving, she looked at Jack. "I'm sorry. We need to continue this conversation another time." He nodded, knowing he couldn't stop her from doing her job. It was one of the things he admired most about her, her unconditional dedication to others, even when she herself was suffering. After she left, Jack was alone in the small office. His gaze fell on the drawer where Emily had hastily put away the papers. For a moment, he considered opening it and discovering the truth on his own. But he couldn't do that. Not to her. Emily deserved his trust and respect. Leaving the center that afternoon, Jack carried a weight in his heart. The roses he had brought remained on Emily's table, their red petals contrasting with the simplicity of the environment, just like their different worlds that had somehow become irreversibly intertwined. In his apartment, later, he couldn't stop thinking about her words. Afraid of not having enough time. What did that mean? What was the secret that Emily guarded so carefully, that made her build walls around her heart, even when it was obvious that she felt something for him too? Jack spent the night awake, looking at the illuminated city through his panoramic window. For the first time in his life, all his money, all his power and influence seemed useless in the face of the mystery surrounding the woman who had stolen his heart. The morning dawned gray in New York City, with heavy clouds promising a storm. Jack had slept little, his mind endlessly replaying the interrupted conversation with Emily. He decided he couldn't wait any longer. He needed to see her, talk to her, understand what was happening. He arrived at the center earlier than usual, only to discover that Emily hadn't shown up yet. Something unusual, since she was usually the first to arrive. "She called to say she'll be a little late," Mrs. Johnson informed, appearing at his side as if reading his thoughts. "She had a doctor's appointment early this morning." "Doctor's? Her appointment?" Jack felt his heart tighten. "Is she sick?" The lady studied him for a long moment before answering. "It's not my place to tell, my boy, but I can say one thing. That girl needs someone who loves her enough to break down the walls she's built around her heart." Before Jack could insist, one of the seniors called Mrs. Johnson to help with breakfast. He was left alone in the small garden, observing the roses that Emily loved so much. The dewdrops on the petals resembled tears, like the ones he had seen in her eyes the day before. Almost 2 hours passed before Emily finally arrived. Jack immediately noticed that something was wrong. She was paler than normal, and there was a fragility in her movements that she tried, without much success, to disguise. "Jack!" She seemed surprised to see him in the garden. "I didn't expect. I thought you'd have meetings today." "I cancelled everything," he replied, approaching. "We need to finish our conversation from yesterday." Emily looked away, her hands clutching her bag strap. "Now is not a good time." "And when will it be?" he asked softly. "Emily, I see that you're suffering. I see that you're carrying an enormous weight alone. Please, let me help." "You don't understand," She shook her head, tears beginning to form in her eyes. Some things don't have a solution, Jack, no matter how much money or power you have. Then help me understand, he took another step towards her, because the only thing I know for sure is that I love you, and that I'm not going to give up. On you. The words hung between them like the heavy clouds in the sky. Emily closed her eyes, a solitary tear running down her face. Please, don't say that, she whispered. Don't make things more difficult. Difficult why? What can be so terrible that you need to face alone? At that moment, thunder echoed in the distance, and the first raindrops began to fall. Emily shivered, not from the rain but from the weight of the moment. Come, Jack gently guided her to her office, closing the door behind them. The rain now fell heavily, creating a curtain of water on the windows. Emily sat down, suddenly, looking exhausted. Her hand trembled as she opened the drawer and took out the exam she had put away the day before. I didn't want anyone to know, she began, her voice almost a whisper. Not even my family. I thought I could handle this alone, continue my work at the center for as long as possible. Jack sat down beside her, his heart beating so hard he could hear it above the sound of the rain. 6 months ago, she continued, I started feeling some symptoms. I ignored them at first, thinking it was just fatigue, but then... Her voice faltered, and Jack resisted the urge to take her in his arms. He knew she needed to say everything, in her own way, in her own time. The doctors discovered a problem. With my heart, she finally revealed, her words barely audible over the noise of the storm outside. A rare condition which is progressing faster than they expected. Jack felt as if the air had been sucked out of the room. But there's treatment, right? There must be specialists' research. There's an experimental treatment, Emily confirmed, wiping away a tear. But the chances, they can't guarantee anything. And I didn't want anyone to get attached to me. I didn't want to cause suffering. And so you decided to suffer alone, Jack asked, his voice choked with emotion. Emily, you've spent all these months carrying this without telling anyone. The seniors at the center, they've already lost so much in life, she explained. I didn't want them to worry about me. And you. You have a whole life ahead of you, Jack. I can't ask you to. You're not asking me anything, he gently interrupted. I'm choosing to be by your side, choosing to fight with you. But what if? She hesitated, biting her lip. What if there isn't enough time? Then we'll make each moment worth a lifetime, he responded, finally giving in to the impulse to hold her hands. Emily, you taught me that life isn't measured in years but in moments, in smiles, in small gestures of love. The rain continued to fall outside, but inside that small office, something was changing. The walls that Emily had built around her heart were beginning to show their first cracks. I love you too, she finally admitted, her voice trembling. And that's why I'm so afraid. Afraid of making you suffer, afraid of not being strong enough. You're the strongest person I've ever met, Jack said, gently drying her tears. But now you don't have to be strong alone. Let me be by your side, Emily. Let me help carry this weight. A particularly loud thunderclap made the windows shudder, and Emily instinctively shrank into Jack's arms. He hugged her, feeling her small and fragile body against his, silently, promising that he would do everything in his power to protect her. The storm outside was a perfect reflection of the turbulence in their hearts, intense, frightening, but also purifying. And just as every storm eventually passes, leaving the air cleaner and the sky clearer, that moment of shared vulnerability marked the beginning of a new phase in their lives. A phase where they would no longer need to carry their fears and hopes alone. In the days that followed Emily's revelation, Jack transformed into a man on a mission. While maintaining his responsibilities at the company, he dedicated every free moment to researching her condition, consulting specialists, and seeking information about the experimental treatment. I found a team of researchers in Boston, he mentioned during an improvised breakfast in the center's small kitchen. They're developing a revolutionary protocol for cases like yours. Emily smiled softly, observing him with a mixture of admiration and concern. Jack, you don't need to stay up all night researching these things. Yes, I do, he replied, taking her hand across the table, because now we're in this together, and together we'll find a way." Mrs. Johnson, who pretended to be busy organizing cups in the cupboard, couldn't contain a smile as she observed the couple. Since Emily had shared her secret with Jack, a subtle but significant change had occurred in her. It was as if an enormous weight had been lifted from her shoulders. "You know what impresses me most about you two?" the lady commented, finally abandoning her discreet observation. "How love can transform even the most difficult situations into opportunities for growth." Emily blushed slightly but didn't let go of Jack's hand. "Mrs. Johnson, you always see the good side of everything." "It's not seeing the good side, my dear," the lady replied, sitting down with them. "It's understanding that life is made of cycles. Sometimes the night seems very dark, but that's precisely when we should be most certain that the sun will rise again." Jack observed how Mrs. Johnson's words affected Emily. It was amazing how that lady had the gift of bringing comfort and wisdom in the most necessary times. "Dr. Roberts called last night," Emily commented after a moment of silence. "He wants to start the new treatment protocol next week." "And are you prepared?" Jack asked softly. "Honestly, I'm scared," she admitted. "But at the same time, for the first time in a long time, I feel like I have reasons to fight with all my strength." The smile she directed at Jack made his heart race. It was amazing how, even amidst so many uncertainties, this woman managed to radiate so much light, so much hope. "So, since you'll need to dedicate yourself to the treatment," Jack began, a special gleam in his eyes, "I have a proposal to make." Emily raised an eyebrow, curious. "What kind of proposal?" "Marry me." The cup Mrs. Johnson was holding almost fell from her hands. Emily was paralyzed, her wide eyes fixed on Jack. "What?" she whispered. "Marry me," he repeated, now holding both her hands. "Not because of your condition, not out of fear of the future, but because I love you. Because I want to be by your side in all moments, good and bad, because you taught me the true meaning of love." "But Jack," Emily tried to argue, tears beginning to form in her eyes. "What if?" "No what ifs," he gently interrupted her. "Let's live in the now. And now, at this moment, all I know is that I want to make you happy. I want to build memories by your side. I want to wake up every day seeing your smile." Mrs. Johnson was no longer trying to disguise the tears running down her face. "Oh, my dears," she sighed, "this is truly a miracle of love." Emily looked deeply into Jack's eyes, searching for any sign of doubt or hesitation. She found none. What she saw was only pure love, determination, and a silent promise to be by her side no matter what lay ahead. "Yes," she finally answered, her voice choked with emotion. "Yes, I want to marry you." The smile that illuminated Jack's face could have brightened the darkest day. He stood up, pulled Emily into his arms and kissed her, a kiss full of promises and hopes for the future. The news of the engagement spread quickly through the center. The seniors, who already considered Emily and Jack part of their family, couldn't be happier. They immediately began planning how they could contribute to the celebration. Mr. Thompson offered to play the guitar, Mrs. Davis promised to make her famous cookies, and even the shy Mr. Wilson proposed to recite a poem he was writing, especially for the occasion. "But it has to be here at the center," Emily insisted when they started discussing the details. "With our family." Jack immediately understood what she meant. Their family wasn't just those defined by blood ties, but all those who had become a fundamental part of their lives. The seniors at the center, the staff, the volunteers. "Of course it will be here," he agreed, kissing her forehead. "I couldn't imagine a more perfect place." That night, after everyone had gone home, Emily and Jack remained in the center's garden, sitting on the bench under the rose bushes that Mrs. Johnson cared for so lovingly. "Are you sure?" Emily asked softly, her head resting on his shoulder. "Sure you want to embark on this journey with me, even with all the uncertainties?" Jack hugged her tighter. "Emily, before I met you, I was sure about everything in my life. I had my plans, my goals, my path perfectly mapped out, but you taught me that the greatest certainties in life aren't in the plans we make, but in the feelings we share." A gentle breeze swayed the roses, bringing their perfume to them. It was as if nature itself was blessing that moment of love and commitment. "Tomorrow we start the preparations for the treatment," he continued, "and we'll face this together one day at a time. But today, at this moment, I just want to be here with you, planning our future, dreaming about our life together." Emily felt her heart, that same heart that worried her so much, fill with a love so great that it seemed it couldn't fit in her chest. It was amazing how life could change in such a short time, how darkness could give way to the brightest light. "You know what I love most about you?" she asked, intertwining her fingers with his. "How you transformed my fear into hope, my loneliness into companionship, my doubts into possibilities." The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky with shades of pink and orange. It was the end of a significant day, but also the beginning of a new journey, a journey they would travel together, facing each challenge with the strength of the love they shared. The news of the wedding transformed the New Dawn Community Center into a veritable headquarters of preparations. Mrs. Johnson naturally assumed the role of general coordinator, delegating tasks and ensuring that every detail reflected the simplicity and love that characterized Emily and Jack. "The flowers have to be white roses," she insisted, carefully pruning the buds in the garden. "They symbolize purity and new beginnings." Emily observed everything with a smile on her lips, dividing her time between the sessions of the new treatment and the wedding preparations. Jack had managed to have the experimental protocol conducted in New York, bringing specialists from abroad to monitor the case. "How are you feeling today?" he asked one morning, finding her in the center's garden after a particularly intense treatment session. "Tired," she admitted, "but happy. Dr. Roberts said the initial results are promising." Jack sat down next to her on the bench, taking her hand in his. He noticed that, despite the fatigue, there was a special gleam in her eyes, a mixture of hope and determination that made him fall in love even more. "Mrs. Davis is planning to make 500 brigadeiros for the wedding," Emily laughed, changing the subject. "She said it's her contribution to our happiness." "Only 500, Jack joked. "Knowing our guests, we'll need at least 1,000. It was amazing how the center had transformed in recent days. The walls were getting new colors, curtains were replaced, and even a small altar was being built in the garden among Mrs. Johnson's rose bushes. Mr. Thompson, revealing a hitherto unknown talent for carpentry, insisted on personally building the arch under which the bride and groom would exchange their vows. "Look what I found," Mrs. Johnson approached, carrying an old photo album. "These are pictures from my own wedding 50 years ago." Emily and Jack leaned over the yellowed images. In the photos, a young Mrs. Johnson smiled radiantly beside her husband, surrounded by family and friends. "The secret to a happy marriage," the lady shared, her eyes shining with memories, "isn't the absence of problems, but the certainty that you are stronger together than apart." That afternoon, while Emily rested in her small office at the center, Jack had a private conversation with Michael in his office at the company. "I need you to temporarily assume the presidency," he announced, surprising his friend. "What do you mean?" Michael asked, astonished. "After the wedding, I'm going to take an extended leave," Jack explained. "Emily and I decided to travel, to visit places she's always dreamed of seeing. I want to give her all the experiences possible, to create unforgettable memories." Michael studied his friend for a moment. "You've really changed, you know? A few months ago, nothing in the world would have made you step away from business." "A few months ago, I didn't know what was really important in life," Jack smiled. "Emily taught me that success isn't measured by numbers in a bank account, but by moments of true happiness." Back at the center late in the afternoon, Jack found Emily sleeping on the couch in her office, a notebook of notes on her lap. He approached quietly and saw that she was making a list. Places to visit with Jack. His heart filled with love. As he read the destinations noted in her delicate handwriting, Paris, Venice, Santorini, Kyoto, romantic places full of history and beauty that he could hardly wait to explore by her side. "Hey," she murmured, opening her eyes sleepily. "How long have you been there?" "Long enough to fall even more in love with you," he replied, sitting down beside her. Emily snuggled into his arms, the notebook sliding to the floor. "I was dreaming about our honeymoon," she confessed. "I know it might seem silly with everything that's happening, but it's not silly at all," he gently interrupted. "It's exactly what we should be doing, planning our future, dreaming together." The sun was beginning to set, casting a golden light through the window. In the garden, they could hear the animated voices of the seniors helping Mr. Thompson with the altar arch. "Sometimes I'm afraid I'm being selfish," Emily whispered, "of asking too much of you." "Emily," Jack held her face between his hands, "you've given me the greatest gift anyone could give. You taught me to truly live, to love without reservations, to see beauty in the simplest things. How could that be selfish?" Tears of emotion shone in her eyes. "Promise that no matter what happens, we'll make every moment count." "I promise," he replied, sealing the promise with a soft kiss. "Every second by your side is already an invaluable treasure." At that moment, Mrs. Johnson appeared at the door carrying a tray with tea and cookies. "I thought you might want a little snack while we review the final details of the wedding," she smiled. The scene was the perfect embodiment of what that center had become, a place where love, care, and hope naturally blended, where difficulties were faced with strength and unity, where each moment was celebrated as a precious gift. "Oh, before I forget," Mrs. Johnson added, "Mr. Wilson finished the poem for the ceremony. He wants to read it to you tomorrow." Emily and Jack exchanged emotional smiles. Each small gesture, each demonstration of affection from the seniors at the center made their wedding even more special and meaningful. Night was slowly falling over New York City, but inside that small office illuminated by love and hope, the future had never seemed so bright. The week of the wedding began with news that filled the New Dawn Community Center with joy. Dr. Roberts, after the latest round of tests, confirmed that Emily was responding positively to the experimental treatment. "The results are very promising," he explained during the consultation, while Emily held Jack's hand tightly. "Your condition is stabilizing, in a way we didn't expect to see so soon." "Does that mean—" Emily began, hardly daring to hope. "It means we're on the right track," the doctor smiled. "The treatment is working better than we anticipated. Of course, we still have a long way to go, but these results are extremely encouraging." As they left the doctor's office, Jack noticed that Emily was strangely quiet. When they reached the center's garden, she finally spoke. "You know what's most incredible," she said, looking at the roses that were beginning to bloom. "Dr. Roberts said part of my recovery might be linked to my emotional state, that the love and support I've been receiving are literally helping my heart to strengthen." Jack hugged her from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder. "That doesn't surprise me one bit. You always said that love has the power to transform lives. Now it's transforming yours." Mrs. Johnson, who was coincidentally pruning nearby roses, couldn't contain her tears upon hearing the news. Soon the entire center was celebrating. Mr. Thompson picked up his guitar and started playing cheerful songs, while Mrs. Davis rushed to the kitchen, determined to make her famous cookies to celebrate. "You see," Mrs. Johnson commented, gathering everyone in the common room, "it's no wonder we chose New Dawn as the name for this place. Each day brings a new chance to start over, to believe, to love." The wedding preparations gained new energy. Emily, with more vitality due to the treatment's success, actively participated in every detail. Her only requirement was that everything remain simple and meaningful. "I want each element to reflect the love we've built here," she explained, while helping to decorate the garden. "I don't need luxury or ostentation. I just need the people I love by my side." Jack, who could have organized the most luxurious ceremony in New York, understood perfectly. The center had become much more than a social project for him. It was the place where his life had truly begun. One afternoon, while supervising the assembly of the altar in the garden, Mr. Wilson asked permission to read the poem he had written for the ceremony. "Love that heals," he began, his voice trembling with emotion. "In life's garden where roses bloom, two hearts found their place. It wasn't fate that united them, but the certainty that together they could transform the world. She brought light where there was darkness, taught that wealth isn't measured in gold. He learned that in the simplest gesture, one can find the greatest treasure. And when the storm threatened their journey, it wasn't fear that prevailed. It was love, stronger than any obstacle, that strengthened their united hearts. Now, under this sky of hope, we celebrate not just a union, but the miracle that happens when love heals a heart. When he finished reading, there wasn't a dry eye in the garden. Emily hugged the elderly man, too emotional to speak. Jack, equally touched, shook Mr. Wilson's hand with deep respect. "That's exactly it," Emily finally managed to say. "That's exactly how I feel." The days leading up to the wedding were filled with small, magical moments. The seniors at the center organized a surprise bachelorette party for Emily, complete with karaoke and old-time dances. Jack, in turn, surprised everyone by announcing that he was donating a new building to expand the center. "But it's not just a building," he explained during the announcement. "We're going to create a research center focused on innovative cardiac treatments so that other people can have the same chance that Emily is having." The news was received with applause and tears of joy. Emily, especially, was deeply touched by the initiative. "You're transforming our love story into hope for other people," she said, hugging him. "I learned from you that true love multiplies when it's shared," he replied, kissing her forehead. On the eve of the wedding, as the final preparations were being finished, Emily and Jack sat on the bench in the garden, their favorite spot at the center. The sun was setting, painting the sky with shades of pink and gold. "Tomorrow," Emily whispered, leaning back against Jack's chest, "we're going to make official something that our hearts have known for a long time. That we're stronger together than apart," he completed, intertwining his fingers with hers. "And that love," she continued, "true love has the power to heal, to transform, to create miracles." The roses in the garden swayed gently with the evening breeze, as if agreeing with their words. In the center, they could hear the animated voices of the seniors making the final adjustments for the next day's ceremony. It was a perfect scene in its simplicity, two hearts that had found each other against all odds, surrounded by the love of a family they had built not through blood ties, but through mutual affection and care. And as night fell over the new, dawn garden, Emily and Jack knew that, regardless of what the future held, their love had created something eternal and precious, a story of hope, transformation, and healing through the power of true love. The dawn of the wedding day brought with it a special light to the New Dawn Community Center. Mrs. Johnson's white roses seemed to shine with their own splendor, and the garden transformed into a fairy tale setting with simplicity and good taste awaited the most anticipated moment for everyone. Emily woke up early in her small apartment, where Mrs. Davis and other ladies from the center were already waiting to help with the preparations. Contrary to the typical nervousness of brides, she felt a deep serenity. "You look so beautiful," exclaimed Mrs. Davis, helping her put on the white dress, a simple but elegant piece that enhanced her natural beauty. "You look like an angel." "An angel who taught us so much about love," added Mrs. Johnson, who had just arrived with a bouquet of fresh roses. "Jack is a lucky man." Emily smiled, looking at herself in the mirror. The experimental treatment had brought color to her cheeks, and her eyes shone with a joy that came straight from the heart. "I'm the lucky one," she said, "for having found not only the love of my life, but an entire family." On the other side of the city, in his penthouse, Jack was also getting ready. Michael, his best man, watched him with a smile as he adjusted his tie for the 10th time. "I never thought I'd see the day when the powerful Jack Harrison would be nervous," Michael joked. "I'm not nervous," Jack replied, still struggling with the tie. "I just want everything to be perfect for her." "And it will be," Michael assured, helping his friend with the tie. "Because what you have is real. It's the kind of love that transforms people, that heals wounds, that builds futures." At the center, the garden was already full of guests. The seniors from the center, staff, volunteers, and some close family members. It wasn't a big party by high society standards, but each person present represented a significant part of Emily and Jack's love story. Mr. Thompson, strategically, positioned with his guitar, began to play softly when Jack arrived at the improvised altar. The wooden arch that he himself had built was decorated with white roses and delicate ribbons, creating a dream setting under the blue New York sky. When the music changed, announcing the bride's entrance, all those present stood up. Emily appeared, at the beginning of the path covered with rose petals, more radiant than ever. But she wasn't alone. All the seniors from the center accompanied her, forming a corridor of love through which she passed. Jack felt his heart race when he saw her. Not because of the dress, not because of the production, but because of the purity of love that overflowed from her smile. The tears he was trying to hold back finally escaped when their eyes met. Mr. Wilson, who had insisted on being the officiant of the ceremony, cleared his throat emotionally before beginning. "We are gathered here," his voice trembled slightly, "to celebrate not just the union of two people, but the triumph of true love over all obstacles. Emily and Jack have taught us that love knows no barriers, is not intimidated by challenges, and has the power to transform lives." During the exchange of vows, there wasn't a dry eye in the garden. Emily was the first to speak. "Jack, you came into my life when I had lost hope, when I thought I had to face everything alone. You not only showed me that true love exists, but you taught me that together we are stronger than any adversity. I promise to love you not just on the good days, but especially on the difficult ones. I promise to be your partner, your friend, your confidant, and I promise to make every moment by your side worth an eternity." Jack took a deep breath, trying to control his emotion before pronouncing his vows. "Emily, before I met you, I thought I had everything. But you showed me that I had nothing that really mattered. You transformed my world, gave meaning to my existence, taught me the true meaning of love. I promise to be by your side in every battle, in every achievement, in every moment. I promise to love you with the same intensity with which you love life and people, and I promise to make each day a new opportunity to make you happy." When the rings were exchanged, simple gold bands that symbolized a pure and true love, Mr. Wilson could barely pronounce the final words of the ceremony. It was Mrs. Johnson who completed, her voice choked. "What love has joined together, let no power in this world put asunder." The kiss of the newlyweds was received with applause, tears, and rose petals thrown to the wind. Mr. Thompson began to play a cheerful song, and soon the garden was transformed into a celebration of joy and love. During the reception, held right there in the center's garden, guests took turns giving emotional speeches. Mrs. Davis served her famous cookies, which disappeared in minutes. Elderly couples danced to the sound of Mr. Thompson's guitar, remembering their own moments of love. In a quiet moment, Emily and Jack moved away a bit, sitting on their favorite bench in the garden. "Happy?" he asked, holding her hand and admiring the ring that now shone on her finger, more than I ever imagined. "Possible," she replied, leaning on his shoulder. "You know, when I received the diagnosis, I thought my story was ending. Little did I know it was just beginning." Jack kissed her forehead softly. "Our story is just beginning, my love, and it's going to be the most beautiful story this garden has ever witnessed." The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky with magical colors, as if nature itself wanted to gift the couple with a special spectacle. The roses in the garden seemed to glow with their own light, and the gentle breeze carried promises of happy days. At the center, the party continued. Love, hope, and joy mingled in the air, creating an atmosphere of pure magic. It was more than a wedding. It was the celebration of the transformative power of true love, the kind of love that heals, strengthens, builds futures, and performs miracles. A year had passed since the wedding in the garden of the New Dawn Community Center. The place, now expanded thanks to Jack's project, had transformed into a complex that included not only the original community center, but also a modern cardiac research center. Emily, wearing a floral dress, walked through the corridors of the new building, occasionally stopping to greet patients and staff. Her smile, more radiant than ever, illuminated every room she passed through. The experimental treatment had been a complete success, and now she dedicated part of her time to supporting other patients going through similar situations. Mrs. Emily, an elderly lady, called from the garden, where several new rose bushes had been planted. "Come see how beautiful the roses we planted are." "Mrs. Johnson," Emily laughed, approaching, "you can make any rose bloom, can't you?" The old gardener smiled wisely. "It's not just me, my dear. Love makes much more than roses bloom." At that moment, Jack appeared in the garden carrying a folder of documents. Even after a year, his eyes still sparkled the same way when he saw Emily. "I just came out of a meeting with the research team," he announced, hugging his wife. "The new treatment protocol we developed is being approved for use in other hospitals across the country." Emily felt her eyes fill with tears of joy. What had begun as her personal battle had turned into hope for thousands of other people. "Look at that," Mrs. Johnson commented. "How God writes straight with crooked lines. Who would have thought that charity event would change so many lives?" The couple sat on the garden bench, the same one where they had shared so many important moments of their story. The center bustled with activity around them. In the old building, Mr. Thompson continued with his guitar lessons for the seniors. In the new wing, doctors and researchers worked tirelessly to develop new treatments. "You know what moves me the most?" Emily said, observing everything around her. "Seeing how our love didn't just stay between the two of us. It multiplied, grew, transformed into something bigger." Jack kissed her forehead lovingly. "You always said that true love has that power, the power to transform lives." At that moment, they were interrupted by Michael, who was approaching with a smile on his face. "Sorry to interrupt the romantic moment," he joked, "but I thought you'd like to know. The Department of Health just approved the expansion of the project to 5 more cities." The news was received with hugs and emotional smiles. What had started as a small community center was turning into a network of hope across the country. "We need to celebrate." Mrs. Davis appeared, already planning to make her famous cookies. "I'm going to call everyone for a special coffee in the garden." Soon the garden filled with people, seniors from the center, staff, researchers, patients. It was a family that grew every day, united by the love and hope that Emily and Jack had planted there. Mr. Wilson, who continued writing poetry, asked for a word. "A year ago, we witnessed in this very garden a miracle of love. Today we see how that miracle multiplies, touching more and more lives. Emily and Jack taught us that true love knows no limits, is not intimidated by obstacles, and has the power to transform not just 2 lives, but the entire world." Emily, moved, squeezed Jack's hand. Who would have thought that that scared girl, who was trying to hide her condition from the world, would find not only the cure, but the love of her life? "And who would have thought," Jack completed, "that a businessman who only cared about numbers and profits would discover that the greatest wealth in the world is in small gestures of love." The afternoon sun bathed the garden in a golden light, making the roses shine like little stars. At the center, life pulsed with a special energy, the energy of love that heals, transforms, and builds futures. "Did you know I received a letter today?" Emily commented, taking an envelope from her bag. "It's from a patient from upstate who started the treatment last month. She says our story gave her the courage to fight, to believe that love can work miracles." Jack smiled, moved. "And it really can, can't it? Look around us. Every smile, every flower that blooms, every life that renews itself. They're small miracles that love performs every day." Mrs. Johnson, who was watching them from afar while tending to her roses, smiled with satisfaction. She had always known, from that first meeting at the charity event, that there was something special between them. Something that transcended the ordinary, that had the power to transform not only their lives, but the lives of everyone around them. The New Dawn Community Center had become much more than a name. It was a fulfilled promise that each day brings with it the possibility of starting over, of believing, of loving. And as Emily and Jack shared another moment on the garden bench, surrounded by roses and by people they loved, they were certain that their story was far from over. Because true love has no end. It only transforms, grows, multiplies, like Mrs. Johnson's roses, which even after being pruned, come back stronger and more beautiful, filling the garden with colors and fragrance. And so, in that garden that had witnessed so many moments of their story, Emily and Jack celebrated not just their love, but the miracle that happens when two hearts meet and decide to transform not only their own lives, but the world around them. Because in the end, that's what true love does. It transforms, heals, renews, and above all, multiplies hope for a better world.